Due to copyright, I can't publish many audiobooks on YouTube. At our audiobook novel service, we offer access to over 300 full novels from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, Wuxia, and more, all in high-quality audio format. Each novel is available with a one-time payment only. No subscriptions, no monthly payment, and no ads. Payments via PayPal or Ko-fi. To browse the full list of available novels, message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out our full catalog on Discord. Chapter 281. The White Crow. The air around Raven crackled with a palpable intensity as she leaned her upper body forward with both swords extended behind her. Whoosh! In a single light line of motion, her body moved with a new fluidity, her blades weaving a deadly dance that blurred the lines between attack and defense, shimmering with a faint but beautiful and pristine white light. Krulgath barely had time to react as Raven launched forward. Her swords had quickly become extensions of a furious whirlwind, striking from multiple angles in rapid succession. Soul essence surrounded her like a swirling cloth, and her strikes birthed persistent crows, biting endlessly on him. It was as if each strike of hers had been given an existential essence of their own. Her crows, however, instead of black, were white. Not that the White Walker cared about that, but Northern found it very strange. They were clearly crows, but every part of them were white, down to their eyes. Strange, he thought, but couldn't afford to avert his focus. He just stared. Each of Raven's blows came faster than the last, slicing through the air with a deadly precision that belied the raw power behind them. Krulgath's bone axe was a blur of motion as he tried to parry her relentless assault. His movements were powerful but increasingly desperate as Raven's attacks chipped away at his defense. The arena echoed with the sharp clang of steel meeting bone and the occasional grunt of pain from the White Walker as Raven's swords found their mark. Despite the ferocity of her assault, Raven knew that Krulgath's strength was not to be underestimated. He had, after all, proved himself through the past few minutes of their duel. He swung his axe in wide arcs, creating gusts of icy wind that forced her to adapt her approach. With each strike, he tried to overwhelm her with his sheer brute force. But Raven's technique was crazy smooth. She moved with the speed and grace of a predator, her strikes calculated to exploit the smallest openings in Krulgath's defenses. Her sword sang through the air, cutting into Krulgath's flesh and drawing blood with every pass. With a roar, Krulgath swung his axe in a desperate attempt to break through Raven's onslaught. The massive weapon cleaved through the air, aimed at her midsection with bone-crushing force. But Raven anticipated his move. She twisted her body, letting the axe pass harmlessly inches from her side, and countered with a vicious upward slash. Her blade found its mark, slicing across Krulgath's chest and sending a spray of blood into the icy air. The White Walker staggered back, a look of shock and pain flashing across his face. Everywhere, the arena, the wind, even his breath seemed to pause in a stunning shock of what just happened. Like it or not, Raven was beginning to have the upper hand in this battle. She had drawn blood from his body more than once. His gaze toughened, cold eyes glowing with a subtle white light of fury. "Looks like things are about to get difficult," Northern muttered. In the instant he did, Krulgath pierced forward like an arrow. He arrived in front of Raven in a flash and powerfully swung his axe. Of course, even though it was belatedly, Raven threw her hands forward to block the attack. But its sheer force was overwhelming that her bones vibrated. She couldn't help but stagger back. And seeing it only made more of Krulgath's attack fly her way. For that moment, the tide of the battle shifted fully to the White Walker's side. And the onlookers began raising their usual cheers. Raven was forced into an entrapping web of defending. Every swing of her sword, every maneuver was in a desperate but usually failed attempt to get past his overwhelming chain of attacks. It was getting frustrating. She couldn't even take a moment to retreat without worrying about his annoying attacks. Her hands throbbed with every swing. The cold did not favor her too, and everything just seemed like they wanted her to lose. And sadly for her, that is how her entire life had always been. Cursed, they call her. She had no place in this world, and every single thing had always worked together to prove that fact right. Raven had always had to fight against an overwhelming number of odds. Before coming to Stelia, Every day was war, and she couldn't erase the feeling of fighting a war that she definitely knew she was losing. After coming to Stelia, she had forgotten about that emotion for a while. For once in her entire life, she actually felt like she had perfect control of her own life, of everything. But right now, she was being reminded again of that feeling. And it did not feel good at all. It sucked. With a defiant cry, Raven threw outside outrightly into his incoming attack. It was so wild and crazy that the White Walker got faltered for a moment and withdrew his attack. But Raven's feet was already on the tip of his axe. She used it as a stepping stone and threw herself back into the air, landing away from him. Krulgath stood frozen in shock. "Woman. Crazy," he muttered, eyes still staring unbelievably. Raven, however, was already shifting into a new stance. "Black Crow Dual Blade Arts, 5th Form, Feathered Fury," she whispered, then disappeared in a wake of white dancing feathers. Krulgath staggered back as Raven was before him in the blink of an eye. She spun with the grace of a dancer, her blades cutting through the air in wide, sweeping arcs. Krulgath's eyes widened in surprise as Raven's swords slashed at him from every direction. He struggled to keep up, his axe moving in a desperate attempt to block her attacks. But Raven's speed and agility were too much for him. Her blades began to find their mark progressively, slicing into his flesh and drawing more blood with each pass. Despite his wounds, Krulgath fought on with a savage determination. He swung his axe in a wide arc, forcing Raven to leap back to avoid the blow. But she was stubborn. She closed the distance between them in an instant, her swords a blur of motion as she launched into another form, muttering beneath her lips. "Black Crow Peripheral Form, Eclipse Slash." She crossed her swords in front of her, their edges gleaming in the dim light. With a powerful twist of her body, she unleashed a combined strike that deflected Krulgath's axe and sent him stumbling back. Krulgath roared in frustration. He swung his axe in a wide arc, creating a wall of icy wind that threatened to engulf Raven. But she moved with the agility of a shadow, slipping past his defenses and delivering a swift strike to his exposed side. Her blade bit deep into Krulgath's flesh, and he howled in pain. He swung his axe in a desperate attempt to fend her off, but Raven was already moving. She danced around him, her swords flashing in the dim light as she attacked from every angle. But she knew she couldn't keep it up for long. She didn't know why, but she could feel that the White Walker had several tricks up his sleeves. She needed a very strong attack to end this duel. Besides, she was already getting severely exhausted. Her stamina usually was something she was proud her. But the cold in this place did not do her any good at all. Chapter 282. Honorable Species. Northern, meanwhile, was earnestly searching, waiting, wondering, what the hell? She's not using her abilities. He washed his face with his hand. Are you telling me she has been fighting the might of a catastrophic hellion with pure skills all this while? No talents involved. Raven was matching the might of a catastrophic hellion with pure skills that had been ingrained in her, perhaps because she is, of course, from the Kageyama clan. If Raven was this impressive, he couldn't help but think of how strong Shin would be. Imagine this deadly blade art in the hands of multiple clones. A truly deadly weapon of assassination indeed. Shin was a master pretender, Northern was sure of it. At this point, he just had to admit that there were a lot of mysteries surrounding that guy that he never saw. It was so easy to overlook because he was so laid back, almost dim, in fact. Northern didn't want to call his father dumb. Still, he watched with intense focus, even if he wouldn't be able to copy it yet. He was dying to see what ability the lady had. He wanted to see why she was so strong. Krulgath's strength was failing. Blue blood streamed from his wounds, staining the icy ground beneath his feet. His movements became sluggish, his swings losing their deadly precision. But still he fought on, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination. Raven gathered her strength, preparing for one final, decisive strike. Her swords glowed with a faint white light as she channeled her essence into them. With another loud cry of defiance, she launched into the final form of her art and shouted, "Black Crow Dual Blade, Improvised Form, Raven's Wrath." Her voice echoed through the arena, and she moved with blinding speed, her sword slicing through the air in a deadly arc aimed at Krulgatha's neck. The White Walker, however, with all the injuries on his body and blood dripping down, stood there, his gaze fixed on the oncoming raven's wrath, an attack that enveloped her in a massive white crow, destroying even the iced ground as she ran towards her target. Northern frowned slightly. What is he doing? Don't tell me he wants to use his... Northern gasped internally. There had been slight moments when Krulgath intercepted with his ability, but Northern didn't think those slight moments were all there was to the White Walker's abilities. As Raven reached in front of the White Walker, with both her swords gliding towards his neck from opposite sides, a powerful blizzard suddenly exploded between them, instantly enclosing every single thing on the battleground with white fog. Northern squinted his eyes. Others might not have seen what happened, but it wasn't so hard for him. Even though the shock of the blizzard had distracted him for a moment, so he indeed missed that moment. The White Walker had used his ability, a crazy force to counter the force of Raven's attack, hence nullifying it. The thud and explosion that resounded were the result of both forces clashing against each other. That was probably what he thought of doing since the beginning. Raven was standing, staggered, blood dripping down from her forehead. But the White Walker had sustained more injuries than she did in the course of this battle. Suddenly, a clanging sound was heard. It was the White Walker. He dropped his axe, and took 2 steps backward, then crossed his hands over his face and raised a leg. Immediately, the crowd began to murmur lowly. Northern, confused about what was happening, turned to the person next to him and asked in the monster tongue, "I'm sorry, what is going on?" "Commander-Chief. Yield. Woman. Strong. Very strong." The White Walker with quite the short horn nodded seriously as he responded to Northern. Northern breathed out in relief and watched Raven. She probably didn't need to be told. It was already clear enough from him dropping his weapon. That stance, however, did he have to raise his leg? It was probably a part of their culture, which immediately prompted Northern to remember and ask the White Walker next to him again. "What is Suratal?" The White Walker looked at him for a second, then said, "Suratal. Man-woman. Come. Firewater. Drink. Drink. Stronger man, stronger woman don't sleep. Weaker man, weaker woman sleep." He laughed as he completed. The others beside him also carried the laughter. Northern stared into nothing for a couple of confusing seconds. "So, Suratal is a contest of drinking? Firewater? Alcohol? Then the one that passes out is the stronger one." His mouth slowly fell. This was supposed to be a contest of alcohol? What the hell did I cause? Raven slowly slumped to the ground but fell into the arms of the White Walker's commander-chief. He said to her, "Woman. Suffering. Woman need rest." Northern, seeing her go down, quickly jumped into the arena and hurried to where they were. Only after he had started running did he feel embarrassed and question himself why he ran in hurriedly like that. But he couldn't just stop midway. He collected Raven from him and carried her in his arms. Exhaustion wore her face like an apparel. Her skin was getting whitish. The cold had probably gotten worse since she had carelessly expended herself like that. "You're woman. Strong. Me. Sorry." Krulgath lowered his head a little bit. Northern, in response, nodded his head. "Thank you. You're such an honorable person?" The White Walker tilted his head a little bit in confusion. Honorable? Person. Clearly, he understood not what those words meant, even though he had no trouble pronouncing them in the monster tongue. Northern stared at him, blinking for a few seconds. He didn't quite know how to explain to him that they were an honorable species. The only monsters he had come across that were anything close to being honorable were his hideous guardian angel and night terror. Remembering those two suddenly made him feel melancholy. Krulgath fell to his knee as the boy came towards them. Northern lowered his head. But the boy immediately bowed 90 degrees. "Teacher. Name. Ulzard." Northern was dumbfounded, as well as everyone in the arena. Crap. How can someone be so humble? What leader before his people would bow down before someone else, even if they deemed them a teacher? Or was he just naive? Chapter 283. The Odd Dream, Part 1. Northern automatically became accepted amongst the strange community of White Walkers. He was referred to as teacher and was not one by name alone. Almost everyone in the settlement came to him in need of something. When he spoke, they listened. It was as if they turned to him for some sort of sage advice, and this happened because of only one reason. Their leader bowed before this person. For the first few days of being there, Northern oversaw Raven's recovery. It was amazing how skilled these creatures could be. Even though they clearly didn't need it, they could weave thick cloaks that shielded one from the cold. Northern suspected that the materials for these clothes were likely harvested from cottons that had developed resistance to the harsh environment and climate conditions of this realm. As such, it seemed like the cloaks themselves were imbued with cold resistance abilities. One was made for Northern and Raven, so he felt the need to stop walking around in his dark, scary armor. Raven got better, but it was difficult for her to accept the reality that played out before her. A settlement of monsters that meant no harm. She was probably finally relating to what Northern had said to her a while back, but sadly, he was not usually around for her to discuss it. Days had definitely passed. Unlike Northern's first rift, this one had night and day, although one could not be very sure of the hours in between. Raven sometimes tried to keep note, but she discovered that they were not consistent. She was either making mistakes with her count, or this was just one of the rift's irregularities. But then again, there was no Northern to discuss these things with. The white-haired kid had become a tutor at such an early age. Northern, for once, was glad that his intelligence had some good use. Even though he didn't formally learn the monster tongue, he still could teach as if he had. He could not only properly convey the pronunciation of words but also could formulate how best they probably could be written. Since this was a civilization that was thrown far back, Northern would use a twig to write in the snow as he taught the little Ulzard. The boy king, on the other hand, was a very receptive and obedient one. He had piles of schedules awaiting him, so Northern usually had limited time to spend with him. And when he left him, other White Walkers, male and female, would gather around him to learn. Raven oftentimes would find him in the center of an enormous gathering, teaching them about runes and proper pronunciation of words. To them, he was almost like a revered religious leader. Even sometimes when she watched, that was how he seemed. She would have loved to join his classes many times, but she refused. Raven particularly was worried about what semblance of humanity would be left in her should she decide to learn a monster tongue. That is, even outweighing the question of, would it be possible for a human to learn? How did Northern learn it? Or was he just special enough? She believed in the latter. But she also thought it was the reason why Northern was finding so much difficulty in what should be simple and common sense. Because he could relate with them so much. She tried to imagine how living with monsters for about 6 months would have been. Now, she couldn't help but understand how naive, complacent he was. He probably was a kid that lived in the embrace of his parents all day long, suddenly thrown into a rift and having to survive amidst monsters for 6 months. Only a select few would have made it out and be sane, acting as expected while still being outrightly calculating and sensible in all manners whatsoever. If Northern had turned out to be like that, then it would have made him too good to be true. When she took an objective stance on the kind of person he was and the way he acted inside this rift, she couldn't help but feel like Northern was incomplete outside the rift. In here, he looked so at home. It was a strange thought that crossed her mind, but it really did look like that. Even though he was swarmed with different activities, the guy didn't seem to mind the fact that they were in a rift, which was why she knew it was up to her. She was the last semblance of humanity that was left between both of them. This rift was here for a reason. They needed to find the Guardian and the Rift Core, and kill it. She just hoped that would be possible without. Her somber gaze fell on the people. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. She looked away and walked on. After a while, night fell. Raven was inside the provisional ice cottage that had been made available for her. She sat on the wooden crafted bed with her legs crossed, her eyes closed, and her hands rested on her thighs. She seemed to be meditating. The blue glow from the frozen stick that stood on the side table, seemingly carved directly out of ice, slowly flickered, as if shivering with the subtle and seemingly harmless blow of the wind. She stayed in that position for a while. Then she opened her eyes and just slumped on the bed, staring at the blue, frozen ceiling for a while. Then she muttered, "It's peaceful. Too peaceful." Slowly, her eyes closed peacefully. Raven embraced sleep and began snoring a couple of minutes later. However, she heard a voice. "Raven, Raven, Raven." That voice, she couldn't be mistaken about it. That was Terrence's. "Terrence, is that you?" She quickly sprang up, looking around the room, but she couldn't find anyone. However, she was sure she had heard Terrence's voice. The voice then resounded once more. "Listen well, Raven. This is about the place I walked to the last time when we were traveling." Raven narrowed her eyes. She had demanded about that, but the oracle decided to stay silent. Raven, of course, usually does not force her to speak unless she wanted to. The fact that she's coming to Raven now must mean there is something about where she had gone that has to do with their current predicament. And Terrence probably knew about it, which was why she didn't say anything before now. Does that mean she knew that she and Northern would enter a rift? There was no way to know how much Terrence really knew. But Raven was sure she was a walking trove of information. However, it was incredibly hard to get even an iota of that information out of her. And it was totally understandable because there were consequences for every secretive word or knowledge she spilled. The oracle's voice resounded once again. "Are you there, Raven? I want you to pay rapt attention to this instruction." Raven frowned slightly but nodded. "Take the boy king and flee. You must convince Northern. This cannot be successful without him. If Northern does not consent to it, both of you will die. Tell him you need to take the boy king and find Sura using the green light in the sky. Those green lights will lead you directly to Sura." Raven's frown deepened slightly. Her words were sounding like a lot of trouble. If Northern does not consent to it, both of them would die. What was happening? "Terrence, what is?" Before she could complete the sentence, however, she jolted out of her sleep, her eyes widening fully. All the while, she thought she was awake. Chapter 284. The Odd Dream, Part 2. Throughout the rest of the night, Raven experienced a certain difficulty trying to sleep. What was she to make of this odd dream? First of all, she knew herself very well. She could count the number of dreams she had had all her life on one hand. So as much as she wanted to be reasonable and claim that this might just be a dream, she was quite aware that the odds were against it. She felt it so real. It was as if Terrence had walked directly to her and reached her through a dream. But she never knew the oracle could do something like this. If it does turn out to be the case. Raven smacked her lips in shame. I have looked down on her. No, she admired Terrence's strength. She thought of the oracle as powerful and respected her in that regard. But perhaps this far exceeded her expectations. But it was still within a manageable scope. Because even though she had high expectations for the oracle, she always welcomed a chance for Terrence to spiral out of her control. The reason was that Terrence was oftentimes too silent. Raven knew she kept a lot of things from her. But she also knew that it wasn't because she wanted to. Which was why she always made sure to read the oracle's mood before asking about a certain thing. And there was nothing so far that she had asked that the oracle had not given her answers to. Even when the answers were quite uncomfortable, they were always helpful in ways that no one could ever compensate for. The knowledge about the flying ship started from Terrence, as did the knowledge about Northern's eyes. And they always came like this, in disgruntled bits of information just like this. Raven hence couldn't help but feel that this was another instance of Terrence's help coming just in the time they needed it. Hence, she decided to take it seriously and talk to Northern about it. Not calm enough to wait till the next dawn, she sprang to her feet, took another layer of her blue-colored cloak, and wrapped it around herself, then plunged out of the cottage. Her steps were silent and almost non-existent as she jumped from roof to roof. In a moment or two, she slowly landed on the palace roof. Northern's room was somewhere in this amazing building. With ease, she slipped past the vigilance of the guards, sometimes as if she were a shadow herself. Her movement and stealth came with practiced ease. Eventually, She stood in front of a door thrown away at the end of the hallway that seemed abandoned. She knocked softly and awaited a response. After a couple of seconds, there was no response. Raven was already thinking of ways to break through, but she was, at the same time, trying to avoid commotion. Now more than ever before, they needed to stay silent. But she had no choice if Northern was so fast asleep that he couldn't hear her knock. She clenched her fist and slowly pulled her hand backward. As she lunged it forward, the door opened, and her punch came to an abrupt pause in front of Northern's nose. Unflinched, he raised a brow and muttered, "Come in." Raven squinted her eyes a little bit. He didn't even seem surprised to see her. Was he expecting her? She entered Northern's room and looked around. This was the first time she was coming this close to him since they'd been here. They had both been busy with one thing or another, he especially. Plus, getting around him was difficult since he was being treated as the king's precious teacher every time. "You are living quite the lavish lifestyle," Raven said as she glanced around. Size apart, his room was much more beautiful and pronounced than hers. Glassy ornaments decorated the wall and shelves. Beautiful woven mats were used to create an intricate decoration on the wall. Northern shrugged and looked at her, his arms folded. "I'm pretty sure you didn't just come around here to admire my room." Raven stared squarely into his eyes. "Shouldn't you be asleep at a time like this? Should I be flattered that you are concerned about me?" Raven was silent for a while. Then she said, "We've not seen or spoken to each other since we came here." Northern, in response, looked down. "I think that is my fault. I just sort of got swept away by a lot of things." "I see. So you like it here?" Northern raised his head and frowned at the question, tilting his head back a little as he retorted, "Where the hell did that come from? Do I like a rift?" Raven shrugged with her shoulders. "I mean, while we were outside you seemed eager to leave, go back to the Central Plains, and now, you just look like you're at home." Northern raised a brow. He found her words absurd, but at the same time, something about them did not allow him to dismiss it as nonsense. He shook his head and shoved all that away for now, saying, "We can worry about all of that later. There's something else we need to attend to right now." Raven's eyes widened a little bit. "Did Terrence appear to you in your dream too?" Northern raised a brow, confused. "Terrence appeared to me in my dream? What is she? A dream chaser?" Raven's eyes lowered back in a subtle show of disappointment. "She can travel to places. I'm not exactly sure, but I think she can go to the future, and she can be at other places with her soul." "What's it called again?" Raven pondered. But Northern responded immediately. "Astral projection? Soul projection. You were close." Northern looked away for a second. "It's practically the same thing. Still, who would have thought the Oracle was that amazing? She's a walker of worlds." Northern looked at Raven. "So she appeared in your dream?" Raven nodded and explained to Northern how exactly it had happened and what Terrence had said. Through the short explanation, she could observe Northern thinking deeply. His eyes were out of focus. I see," he just muttered, even as she finished. A couple of minutes later, Northern still seemed to be in deep thought. Finally, after she couldn't wait anymore, Raven gave way to her voice and asked, "If you didn't dream about Terrence, why exactly do you look like you were expecting me? And what is the something else we need to attend to right now?" Northern looked at her blankly for a couple of seconds, then gestured towards the wooden chair beside his bed. "Sit. This will take a little while." Chapter 285. A Clueless Fellow. Raven sat on the chair and relaxed. Surprisingly, it was even more comfortable than her own bed. It was as if the wood was made from entirely different materials. Everything in Northern's room reeked of luxury. She almost felt jealous. Northern spent a few moments gathering his thoughts while Raven waited on the wooden, comfortable chair. After a few minutes passed, Raven mumbled, "So?" Northern leaned against the wall and folded his arms. "Something is strange about this place. I don't quite know how to put it. The entire civilization of these monsters revolves around Ulzard." Raven raised a brow. "And what exactly is strange about that?" "He's their king." Exactly, Raven. It's not that I don't understand, but these things feel extreme sometimes. He's a king, not a superstar. Raven cocked her head a little. What's a superstar? Shocked, Northern squinted his eyes in suspicion. After a couple of silent seconds, he asked carefully, "The aide's for, you don't listen to their songs?" Raven frowned subtly. "What is a song?" "Eh? No way." The concept of songs was not strange. Electronic devices existed in Trael but were created and managed in a completely different manner from the world he used to know. This manner solely relied on rift resources, just like how a crystal was the power source of an entire flying ship. These rift resources could power many things, including electricity and electronic devices. Northern had first heard the human sound over a radio with his father singing along and dancing. It happened almost every morning when Shin woke up. At first, he hated the band because they sounded like they were singing a country song from the 80s back on Earth. But somehow it began to grow on him. At 10, he began to sing along with his father, but often just in his room. He had come to know several other bands. He had friends who wanted to gain talents so they could enter the stardom industry, the world of entertainment, and become superstars. But such a life was never for him. Not that he envisioned himself in some desolate continent, fighting for his life. Neither was the life he wanted. It was incredibly shocking that Raven didn't even know the meaning of a song, let alone superstar. Did she grow up in a cave? Northern wondered. Somehow, he couldn't help but feel like the girl's childhood would have been no fun at all. Because even the lowest of the low, a country bumpkin like himself, knew about it. For her not to know, it must be, "Can you stop staring at me like that and just continue what you were saying?" Raven's voice was almost dripping with irritation. She sounded neither attractive nor unattractive. Her voice was pretty normal. Northern shook his head slightly and continued, "What I'm trying to say is, even for a king, such an amount of love can be disturbing. These guys are literally poking their noses into every business of his. When I sit down to teach them, it's not actually because they want me to teach them. It's like they want to spend time with me because I spend time with the kid." He shook his head dreadfully as he remembered. "They ask me, what is the last word King Ulzard uttered? Did he eat? Does he smile a lot? On, and trust me, there are even extremely weird questions." Raven narrowed her eyes at him. Northern, in response, stared for a couple of seconds, then shook his head. "Nah, I'm not going to tell you those." Raven nodded assertively. "Try me." Her eyes burned with those stubborn red flames, informing Northern that she was probably not going to back down until he spoke. Embarrassed, Northern turned away slightly as he said it to her in a low tone. "They asked the size of his PP." Raven cocked her head yet again. "What's a PP?" Northern's eyes widened as they glided back to hers. Her eyes were drenched in sincere confusion. She really didn't know what a PP meant. Awkwardly, he tried explaining, "You know, like a third leg but for a man, in between the two legs and much smaller than the two legs." She frowned in confusion. "A man has a third leg? How can a man have a third leg? Is that supposed to be a tail?" "Yes, like a tail but in front." "A tail in front?" Northern dropped his head. There is no hope for this girl. She really must have grown up in a cave. Raven folded her hands. "I can see you are finding it difficult to explain. This PP thing, is it a good or a bad thing?" Northern stared blankly for a couple of seconds. If one was to put it like that, was it good or bad? Even he didn't have a justified answer. He shrugged. "I guess it's like a perverted thing?" With an emotionless face, Raven pressed on. "Is it good perverted or bad perverted?" Northern was caught in a tight spot by that question. He thought for a while, then responded, "I believe, Raven, that some things are not as simple as good or bad. Then we ignore it and move on. What matters is what good or bad effect this perverted thing has." Northern was dazed for a while. He didn't even know how to process her manner of thinking. "I wonder if she even knows the meaning of sex. So, was there any other observation that stood out and made you find this whole love for their king weird?" Northern's gaze became a little somber. In the shadow of the dimly lit room, his eyes glowed a bit, revealing his undisputed beauty, one that Raven had never seen before. He seems to be at his happiest when he's with me, and sometimes, his expression is always as if he is asking for help. Raven's eyes squinted together as she asked, "Asking for help from what?" Chapter 286. A strange feeling. "I don't know, but I'm sure there is something wrong." "That's a baseless assumption, Northern." "I know." Raven looked at him for a couple of moments, then curved a corner of her lips and scoffed. Northern frowned. "What is it?" "I'm quite surprised. I had no doubts that you were carried away by the beauty of this place. It seemed to me that you wouldn't even mind spending eternity here." Northern grimaced. "Are you insane? Why would anyone want to spend eternity in a rift? Have you ever felt like you don't belong anywhere, and then you get to somewhere and feel like you belong?" Northern stared blankly at her for a couple of seconds, then looked away. A feeling like that was very relatable in his past life. No matter how much he tried, he was just an outcast struggling to fit in. And when his supposed girlfriend came his way, that was the one time he truly felt alive and found a home in society. Her family became his. But in the end, it was all lies. Northern's expression became intensely dark. Regardless of what was going on in his mind, Raven continued. "The continent of Stelia is it for me. Sometimes I don't want to leave, and when I saw your eyes in this rift, it's almost the same as mine when I first arrived here." Northern breathed. "I'm glad you said, almost." He paused and continued. "While I do find this place exciting, I'm not dense, and my vision is not obscured. In the end, this is a reality I do not fit into. It's one meant to breed destruction and nothing more." Raven smiled a little bit. "Scary. I've had to learn the hard way, but I can't lie, I do find this to be a very comfortable environment. I can fight without pretending and without restraints." Raven nodded and smiled once again. A couple of silent seconds passed. Then her voice resounded in the dimly lit room again. "So what do we do now? Should we follow Terrence's orders?" Northern was in thought for a while, his eyes fixed on the ground. Then he retorted, "I think we need to talk to Ulzard." Raven nodded in consent. "That's sensible, and it would be completely easy for you to do." But Northern shook his head. "No, not under those circumstances." "Why?" He explained. "All these days, he has not been able to say anything, at least not in clear terms. I'm guessing there should be a reason for it. Maybe he's being watched, and he doesn't want to get caught." Raven gently touched her hair and tucked it behind her ear. "Strange." She belatedly looked at Northern, who looked like he had entered a trance. "Is something else wrong?"
No.
"Not at all," Northern responded, vigorously shaking his head. He seemed to be shaking away many thoughts with that gesture. "Have you actually thought? Maybe Ulzard asking you to teach him was because he needed help?" Northern frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "Well, I don't think there's a better environment to communicate his need for help than the one that both of you have now. What if he's just being smart about it? So you're saying maybe we just need to wait for him? Or at the very least, ask him in a way that others wouldn't suspect, even if they are keeping both of you under intense surveillance." Northern's eyes lowered for a few seconds. Then he raised them back to look at her and commented, "You are correct. I think I'll use writing, now that I think about it. He is always mostly interested in learning how to write since I suggested it. But the time he got to spend with me suddenly reduced after Krulgath observed I was teaching him writing. He asked once what it was, and I told him it's a form of communication that was incredibly hard to learn." Northern paused. "What?" Raven inquired, seeing his sudden silence. "Well, I didn't think much about it then, but now that I try to remember, I think he might have given me a little condescending gaze." Raven leaned back and sighed. "So what do we do?" Northern was silent for a while. "How about I speed up things with Ulzard? I'll try to get what is wrong on his part, and maybe you should try finding how the colors in the sky are supposed to lead us to Sura." Raven nodded. "Sensible. Yeah, because in your dream, Terence made it seem like Sura is alive, and these creatures talk about him like some myth. Do you think he's one of them, an origin or a tyrant? Northern shook his head a little bit and smiled with the corner of his lips. No, Raven. Let's not forget that this is a Tier 4 rift. The Guardian is going to be a Maelstrom rank. I don't think any origin or tyrant would be a Maelstrom rank. I think they'd probably be much higher, and who knows, they might follow the Drifters ranks. But what I'm trying to say is that the rift tier would be much higher if we were facing a tyrant or an origin. Raven nodded gently. That makes sense. You are making a lot of sense. I find that baffling. And I find your statement just now offensive. Raven chuckled. It was a sweeping moment, but her face glowed with a dark, enigmatic allure that could captivate even the coldest heart. Northern felt a beat or two skipped within his chest and quickly looked away. I'm just worried about the poor kid. That's all. Her smile widened sincerely. Would you be concerned if Ulzard was a human kid? Northern frowned in defiance. Of course I would be. What? You think I'm some maniac that favors monsters over humans? Raven looked into his eyes. Anyone would think so, but perhaps everyone was wrong. I was wrong? Would you be willing to help me understand who you are? Northern felt like a wind of butterflies blew past him. His stomach churned uncomfortably too. His cheeks reddened, and his chest was beginning to burn. Something was wrong. He didn't like this at all. Chapter 287. Soul Vessels, Part 1. Northern resumed his day as usual, although due to the previous night's conversation, he was now more aware of his surroundings. And strangely, they too seemed more aware of him too. The White Walkers did not miss any slight chance to be vigilant, and the proximity they allowed him to their leaders was intensely supervised. All these were hints to Northern that something very strange was happening among these creatures. Perhaps they were not the kind creatures he thought them to be. But how and why? He was conflicted. Even up until this very moment, they have not reacted in any contradicting manner as to which they had portrayed themselves. With how vigilant they are around him, when he walks up to them and greets them, they reply ever so lively, like they are full of so much joy. But today those genuine smiles of theirs seemed fake. Northern didn't know if that was his own issue. Maybe he just couldn't bring himself to see the sincerity in their smiles after all the suppositions that he and Raven had made in the midnight hour. Now, that did not mean that their smiles were not genuine, or maybe they were not. That is how confused Northern was. He sat at the edge of the ice cliff where he usually taught Ulzard. Usually, he would be walking around and enjoying the attention people gave him, but this time it was different. He wanted to clear his head, he wanted to think. He continually glanced into the clear white sky. The colors in them were as though they didn't exist, but Northern could see them. It was faint and obscured because of the light of day. I wonder what is the source of light around here. Northern had observed the absence of a daystar, which was why he proposed the question in his mind. However, he didn't think he'd stay long enough in this rift to find out about that information. Another thing that kept bothering him were the bitterness and mystery he had read about in the tower, with everything said and done. His mind continually inquired about the question, is the Chaos Prince dead or alive? Northern didn't know which answer to wish for. With the way the Chaos Prince was portrayed, he looked like someone who was a menace for a living. Someone with a lot of trouble. If he knew Northern had his powers, would he be willing to let him live? Northern suddenly felt his blood run cold. The thought of encountering the Chaos Prince, in fact, any origin or tyrant, made him shudder with fear. And the only solution to this fear was to get stronger. He suddenly felt that overwhelming rush to do something. He just didn't want to be like this, for the sake of the future at the very least. So he wouldn't lose his head before he even knew it. Because these beings, he was sure they existed at a different stratum than he or anyone had ever known. They were the true definition of monsters. He closed and opened his eyes gently. Then he moved away from the edge of the cliff. Northern summoned the new beings he added to his Void Soul arsenal. Immediately, a coagulation of blue smoke surrounded him. He first found it strange because he had thought them to be shadows when he first met them. Now, however, they were more like a mass fog than shadows. Let's see. Northern immediately summoned their information. Name Pangu. True name, nil. Danger level, nil. Void rank, echo. Void ability, soul vessel. Soul fragments, 0/1000. Northern frowned a little bit. He inspected the rest of the summons, which were also the same thing. When he was done, he scratched the back of his head in confused confusion. What the hell? However, just then, a new tab popped up to his view, saying, Soul Vessel Description. Pangu, Lamla, Cuckoo, Hentu and Shay are created as empty shells because they serve the purpose of holding a bodiless soul. Because of their purpose, they have an incorporeal form until a tangible soul is merged with them. After the soul is merged with them, they take on the identity of the soul. However, they maintain their own personality and can return to their incorporeal form upon command, while still holding the properties and abilities of the soul they hold. Do you want to merge a soul? When Northern was done reading, he felt his heart skip a beat. This was not like that time with Raven. This was a good feeling, one that made all the hair on his body stand on end. One full of excitement, because this just provided a very soothing solution to the one problem he had been facing all this while. With this option, he really didn't have to worry about upgrading the cloning ability, which usually would take a lot of his growth time and talent fragments. Even after assigning the 2 most powerful souls he has now, he can still save the rest of the 3 for later when he fights more monsters. This is good, very good. He was particularly looking forward to having Krulgath. Not that he wanted to kill the commander. In fact, he dreaded the thought of it and hoped that he and Raven were wrong. But really, even if he was wrong, when has Raven ever been wrong? If there were chances for this notion to be wrong, Raven would definitely have pointed it out. Everything matched up quite well and fitted together. The more Northern thought about it, the more uncomfortable he felt about everything. Indeed, every rift has its own plight and difficulty, and one cannot measure the difficulty of one based on another. Northern gulped and answered, Yes, let's merge a soul. Choose your soul. Call. Corpse Eater. Corpse Eater. There were several other Corpse Eaters, then Bulfers. But Northern was just after 2 souls for now. Call. Call has been selected. Do you want to merge Call with Pangu, Lamla, Cuckoo, Hentu or Shay? Let's merge him with Pangu. Merging Soul Call with Void Summon Pangu. Merging complete. Immediately, the fog in front of him danced a little bit and seemed to reduce. Pangu's new information appeared. Name, Pangu, Call. True name, the 2nd shard. Danger level, catastrophe. Void rank, echo. Void ability, soul vessel. Soul fragments, 0/1000. Right in front of the name, there was another option to switch profile information. Northern, after reading this tab, naturally switched. Name, Call, Pangu. True name, the 2nd shard. Attributes: Blood Ravager, Son of War, Cursed of Corn. Attributes ability: Blood Lance, Blood Curse. Danger level, catastrophe. Soul rank, Maelstrom. Soul fragments, 0/300. Talent: Shards of Darkness. Talent class, S. Talent ability: Veil of Darkness, Red Lance. Chapter 288. Soul Vessels Part 2. Finally, there was the answer to the question he had always asked himself. Do monsters have talents? Apparently, according to what he saw of Call's profile information, he now knew monsters have talents too. Of course they do. Else it wouldn't make sense how I'm able to absorb talent fragments. Which meant the only reason why he didn't see it in lower rank monsters was because their talents were not yet fully formed. The different case was if the monster had a true name. Northern believed that a true name gave a monster a more definite essence. Hence their talents could manifest, but not to the extent of a fully formed talent. Another question that now bugged him was how does he copy monsters' talents? Because he was sure he fought Call and gained nothing from it. Or maybe throughout their fight, the Castle Lord didn't use his talent abilities at all. The only way was to inspect the information of the talent abilities. Veil of darkness. A shroud of darkness envelopes your entire being, an ultimate defensive veil. Attacks cannot penetrate you in this form. Even if they do, they are lost in the darkness. Red Lance. You can manifest crimson lances carrying an attack weight equal to your resolve. Oh, I know Veil of Darkness. Undoubtedly, this was the cloak of darkness the castle lord always wore. Sadly, he took it off willingly when they were about to get serious. I wonder what would have happened if he didn't. With the level of strength Northern was seeing from Call, he continually felt like he and Night Terror probably just had an easy win. He sighed. I guess I am not able to copy monster talents the way I can copy humans. If he could, everything would have seemed too easy. Now, there was nothing wrong with things being easy, but easy didn't have deep enough roots to withstand the fiery test of time. Sometimes, hardship is endured not for the result but for the process of building one's resolve, mindset, and fortitude. Northern decided to let it rest for now. He would keep an introspective mindset and figure out how to copy monster talents later on. He was sure that would be a great addition. But right now, he had to focus on what he could control, using all available resources to grow stronger. His eyes glided towards the bottom of the floating panel, where he saw additional information. When monsters are slain, soul fragments are gained which contribute to the growth of the void summon and not the soul summon, which meant that Call as a soul would not be getting any stronger, just like Night Terror didn't. However, Pangu would grow stronger and possibly even evolve in rank as a void summon. Another downside was that he couldn't have Pangu harvest talent fragments for him because kills were converted into soul fragments. So, in the end, I have to use my clones. But at the very least, he could have allies that would help him grow stronger in the meantime while he focused on at least becoming a master before spending any precious talent fragments on evolving talents. As a master, by my calculations, I will have 10 talents, both owned and copied. Northern giggled internally. 10 talents. He was sure as a master, he'd be able to defeat Helena easily. A wry grin spread across his lips as he thought about it. But that was enough of that. On to the next. Let's save the savory for when it comes to fruition. Merge Corpse Eater with Lamla. Merging Soul Corpse Eater with Void Summon Lamla. Merging complete. Name: Lamla, Corpse Eater. True name: Nile. Danger level: Apex. Void rank: Echo. Void ability: Soul Vessel. Soul fragments: 0/1000. Name: Corpse Eater. True name: Nil. Attribute: Ravage Hunger, Kin of Darkness. Attribute ability: Danger level: Abysmal. Soul rank: Savage. Soul fragments: 0/300. Talent: Nil. Talent class: Nil. Talent abilities: Nil. Northern smiled, content with what he saw. He would have loved to summon both material bodies to this reality but stood the risk of being seen. He didn't want to believe the White Walkers didn't have one or two on his trail. So he decided to just do the next thing on his agenda until Ulzard arrived. Northern materialized the Soul Eater, then pushed forward a leg. Then, absorbing himself into the moment, he began swinging his sword hand forward. With every swing he slid his leg a step. Honestly, he didn't know what he was doing. However, what he hoped to achieve was a familiarity of some sort, familiarity with the sword and the chaos footwork. And so he continued like that. A couple of hours later, Northern's face was dripping with cold sweat. He had not taken a single break and had continually moved both his legs and sword simultaneously while absorbing his senses into each moment. He felt his muscles ache, but he also knew he could keep going. It would be laziness to stop just because of a few aches. So Northern continued despite the pain in his joints and muscles. However, he suddenly heard a voice. "You are doing it wrongly," the voice said. He paused and looked around him. There was no one. Clearly, not minding what he had just heard, he faced front and continued swinging. "Oh? You are just gonna outrightly ignore me because you can't see me? How rude." Northern paused and stood straight this time. There was a thick sourness to the voice, so he could deduce the speaker was probably male. Why hide and talk to me? Hide? I'm not hiding. To show myself, I'd have to travel over 1,000 kilometers. That's a lot of walking, even for a youngster like me. You want to learn? Or do you want to talk? Strange. It was really strange, but Northern wanted to learn, even though he felt very stupid talking to a voice without a face. I want to learn. Good. I like your humility. Let's start with how to swing a sword properly. Chapter 289. The Faceless Guide. First, relax your shoulders, the voice instructed. Northern tried to comply, straightening his back and shaking off the tension. A sword is not a club. It should move with the grace of a leaf falling through the air, not the force of a hammer. Northern nodded, adjusting his grip on the Soul Eater. It felt awkward, the sweat on his palms making the hilt slippery. Hold the sword like you would a bird, the voice continued. Firm enough that it won't escape, but gentle enough not to crush it. Feel its weight. Let it become an extension of your arm, not just an object you wield. Northern did not understand Jack that the voice was saying, but he complied. He tightened his grip momentarily, then eased it. The moment he did, however, a striking perception of the sword's balance flowed into him. He could almost feel it pulsing with a life of its own, ready to respond to his every move. His eyes widened as he questioned, "How? Amazing, isn't it? You don't have to be so hard on it. Sometimes it's okay to ease up and give it a space of its own. A space to act, a space to be." The voice paused and added, "Although I am quite shocked that you could feel it on a first try. Makes me envious. Are you a genius or something?" "Nah, I doubt that." Northern smiled a little, but it soon faded away, lest he be seen as a madman. The voice continued, "Now align your body with the sword. Stand with your feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent. Your center of gravity should be low, stable. Think of yourself as a rooted tree, strong and unmoving, yet flexible enough to sway with the wind." Northern shifted his stance, feeling the ground solid beneath his feet. He imagined roots extending from his soles, anchoring him to the earth. Taking a deep breath, he immediately felt a new sense of stability and strength. Good. Now, raise the sword above your head, point aimed at your opponent's throat. This is your guard, your starting point. From here, every movement must flow with intention, precision. He lifted the sword. Again, the moment he did, the weight of the sword settled above him. The position felt exposed, making him uneasy, but he said nothing and just decided to obey the voice guiding him. Imagine a line extending from the tip of your sword through your body and into the ground. This is your axis, your balance point. Any deviation from this line will throw you off balance. Northern visualized the line, straight and unwavering. He adjusted his posture slightly, feeling the alignment snap into place. Now swing. Not with your arms, but with your entire body. The power comes from your core, from the rotation of your hips and shoulders. The sword should slice through the air effortlessly, guided by your intention. He pivoted his hips, letting the motion ripple up through his torso and into his arms. The ghostly sword cut through the air with a satisfying whisper, the movement fluid and controlled. Better. But remember, it's not just about strength. It's about timing, precision, and awareness. You must be in harmony with your sword, your body, and your surroundings. Only then will you find true power. Northern repeated the motion, each swing becoming more refined, more connected to his core. He could feel the sword responding to his every thought, its blade an extension of his will. "Close your eyes," the voice commanded softly. "Feel the air around you. Listen to the sound of your breath, the heartbeat of the world. When you swing, imagine cutting through not just your opponent, but through time and space itself." Northern closed his eyes, focusing on the sounds and sensations. The gentle rustle of cold wind and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He swung again, and this time, it was as if the sword moved through water, the resistance giving way to a smooth, effortless glide. Excellent. You've begun to understand. The essence of swordsmanship is not in the blade, but in the unity of body, mind, and soul. The sword is a mirror, reflecting your inner state. Master it, and you master yourself. Northern opened his eyes, feeling a newfound clarity. The voice was right. The sword felt lighter now, almost as if it were part of him. Each swing was a dance, a harmonious blend of strength and grace. Remember, the voice said, a hint of pride in its tone. A true swordsman does not fight with rage or fear. They fight with purpose, with calm and focused intent. Continue to practice, and you will find your own path to mastery. Northern bowed his head slightly, a gesture of gratitude. Thank you, he murmured to the unseen guide. The voice chuckled softly. You're welcome. Although this was supposed to be longer, I've never seen anyone get it on their first trial. Even I didn't. Anyways, keep your heart steady and your blade sharp. I'll come see you some other time. With that, the voice faded, leaving Northern alone with his thoughts and his sword. He took a deep breath, feeling a sense of excitement, peace, and determination. The swing of his sword just now felt so different and so fluid than it had ever felt since he had started swinging the sword. He looked at his hands and the sword. What is this feeling? I want to continue swinging, he murmured to himself. Sadly, he was out of time. He could already sense the boy king coming from afar. That was not anything new. He had sense attribute after all. Northern dismissed his sword and smiled with his hands behind his back as the boy king reached him with joy. Ulzard bowed vibrantly, and when he raised his head, he uttered, I look forward to lessons with you today too. Northern's eyes widened a little bit. The boy's speech has gotten very good compared to the last time they met. He felt so proud. A warm smile then graced his lips, wearing a beautiful and serene glow on his face. As usual, Ulzard, I look forward to teaching you too. But today, Ulzard, I'll be teaching you something different. The boy king tilted his head a little bit. Northern's smile widened, his eyes shining with a dark, dangerous glint. Do you want to learn another language? The language of the humans. Language of the humans? Another language. The boy was at first dumbfounded, but as he stared into Northern's eyes, his eyes slowly widened, and then he rigorously nodded his head. Yes. Chapter 290. The Art of Language. Northern gazed at the young king before him. Ulzard's eyes sparkled with curiosity and eagerness. The boy's enthusiasm was almost tangible. Language is much like swordplay. Northern began, his voice calm and measured. Both require grace, practice, and a deep understanding of subtle movements. Today, we start a new journey. As Northern spoke, he realized that what he had just said again deepened his understanding of swordplay. Ulzard's youthful face tightened in concentration. Will it be hard? Northern chuckled softly. Not as hard as it seems, if you listen closely and trust in your own abilities. He motioned for Ulzard to sit on a nearby flat stone, its surface smoothed by time. The boy king settled down, his eyes fixed on Northern. Northern paced slowly in front of him, choosing his words carefully. Language, he said, is built on sounds and symbols. Your people and mine use different symbols to represent similar sounds. The trick is to find the bridge between them. Ulzard nodded slowly, his expression a mix of determination and confusion. Northern took a deep breath and continued. Think of our runes as the skeleton of our words. Each rune has a specific sound, a part of the whole word. Your language, the tongue of monsters, uses similar building blocks but arranges them differently. He bent down, tracing a simple rune in the snow with a twig. This, he said, is the rune for a. In your language, it would be more like this. He altered the symbol slightly, merging the curves and lines into a form more familiar to Ulzard. Ulzard leaned forward, his fingers tracing the new symbol. It looks like the rune for a in our tongue. Northern nodded. Exactly. And this similarity is what we'll use to learn. Many of our runes have counterparts in your language. We just need to map them out and practice. He stood back, letting Ulzard absorb the information. The boy's eyes darted between the symbols, his lips moving silently as he tried to memorize them. Now, let's start with something simple, Northern continued. He drew another rune next to the first, then a third, forming a word. This is ice. In your language, it would look like this. He modified the runes slightly, simplifying them into shapes Ulzard would recognize. Eyes? Ulzard said slowly, piecing the sounds together. Yes, that's close, Northern encouraged. But listen to how I say it. Ice. The sounds flow together, blending smoothly. Ulzard tried again, closer to the correct pronunciation this time. Northern smiled, proud of the boy's quick learning. Very good. Now let's try another. He drew the runes for land, explaining each symbol as he went. Ulzard watched intently, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to grasp the sounds and hold them tight. For the next hour, they continued this way. Northern introduced new words, and Ulzard repeated them, his voice gaining confidence with each attempt. The boy's progress was remarkable. His natural talent for language shone through. But Northern, of course, knew that the real challenge would come in bridging the gap between the two tongues. It wasn't just about translating in his mind but thinking directly in the new language. This would take time, patience, and a deep understanding of both languages. As they worked, Northern noticed something fascinating. Ulzard's ability to grasp the new sounds and symbols seemed almost instinctual, as if he were uncovering something he had always known but never fully understood. Your progress is impressive, Northern said finally, his voice filled with genuine admiration. But there's more to learning a language than just words. You must also understand the flow, the rhythm, and the culture behind it. Ulzard tilted his head, his eyes questioning. Language, Northern explained, is more than just sounds. It's how we express our thoughts, our feelings, our very being. To truly learn a language, you must also learn about the people who speak it, their ways, their stories. He paused, considering how best to convey this abstract concept. Then an idea struck him. Let's tell a story, he said. A simple one, using the words we've learned. Ulzard's eyes lit up with excitement. A story. Yes, please. Northern smiled and began, speaking slowly and clearly. Once upon a time, there was a boy king who lived in Iceland. He ruled a settlement of White Walkers. He paused, letting Ulzard absorb the words. The boy's lips moved silently as he repeated them to himself. The White Walkers loved the boy king, Northern continued, because he is their ruler, and they are his subjects. Northern observed Ulzard's expression and noticed a slight frown on the boy's face. After repeating Northern's words, Ulzard picked up the twig and wrote on the ground as he pronounced each word. He wrote subject, then ruler, and looked at Northern with a somber expression. He shook his head and drew an arrow between the words, indicating they should be swapped. A small frown creased Northern's brows. What does this mean? He wondered. Then his eyes narrowed as he sensed the White Walkers coming. A sad smile crossed his lips as he spoke to the boy. I guess our lesson ends here for today. We'll continue tomorrow, hopefully. He erased all the writing in the snowy ground and looked to his left, where 3 White Walkers were approaching. They bowed slightly to Northern and more deeply to the boy king. Northern watched as the boy king stood up, showing no joy, and was escorted away. He couldn't help but ponder what the boy had just tried to communicate. The more he thought about it, the more worry clouded his mind. He sat down tiredly on the flat stone Ulzard had occupied minutes ago and reflected deeply. Instead of returning to the settlement to enjoy the attention and respect of the people, Northern decided to stay and practice more with his sword. Northern continued to practice, the voice's teachings echoing in his mind. He focused on the interplay between his breath and his movements, seeking a deeper connection with the sword. Hours passed as he swung the blade, each motion more precise than the last, his body becoming a vessel of disciplined power. As twilight approached, casting long violet shadows across the icescape, Northern paused to catch his breath. He stared into the horizon as the sky began to glow with those familiar colors again. He sighed and dismissed his sword, I think I should rest. He really needed it, and he hadn't eaten anything all day. Chapter 291 Report. Raven watched as the White Walker paced back and forth. She leaned against the palace wall, observing the settlement. She still struggled to believe this was a community of monsters. Despite their human-like behaviors, there were stark differences that helped her maintain her sanity. At first glance, the settlement seemed vast, but now it felt as though Raven had explored every part of it. Buildings were scattered everywhere around the palace. Except behind it. Since there were no houses there, White Walkers were rarely seen in that area. In fact, she had never seen anyone there. The backdrop was just a massive ice mountain. Nothing more, nothing less. Leaning against the palace wall, Raven continued to tap her foot on the ground. It was her habit when something was bothering her. She bit her lip, leaned away from the wall, looked left and right, and then moved towards the back of the palace. After a while, she found herself behind an enormous wall. She felt vulnerable for some reason. There were no guards, no White Walkers in this place. The massive ice mountain wall against the back of the palace created a dark, narrow alleyway. Raven stood there looking around. She was trying to figure out if she had missed something when she noticed something peculiar. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand and looked at it. I'm sweating. To be precise, she was starting to feel warm. Which shouldn't be happening at all, considering that this part of the settlement should be the coldest. Raven frowned at this discovery and stared keenly at the mountain wall. There was nothing strange about it, it was just the base of the mountain. But she didn't want to give up. She was sure that something was wrong. Something had to be there. Something generating an unusual amount of heat. However, Raven didn't have much time to investigate. She could hear footsteps coming closer, accompanied by soft chuckles. So she decided to leave something behind. She shifted her sleeve, and from a tattoo near her elbow, a black bird emerged. It fluttered into the air and disappeared. Then Raven also slipped away. A few seconds later, 2 White Walkers stopped in front of the mountain base. The same spot Raven had been examining all day. They stood silently, not saying a word, as if they were guarding a door. Only there was no door here. From the highest roof of the palace, Raven covered one of her eyes while the other turned pitch black. Immediately after removing her hand, her eye returned to its usual crimson color. She glanced at the guards and frowned deeply. Something is wrong, she muttered before flying away gracefully like a butterfly. Northern, after having a fulfilling dinner, tiredly made his way through the dark, guarded halls of the palace. No one paid him any special attention since he was a regular resident here, even a well-respected one. Although Northern now suspected that they might have placed him in this location to keep an eye on him. Because sometimes that's exactly how it felt. Like he was being watched. He didn't mind. He just held his stomach and walked away, having once again consumed the White Walker's strange vegetable soup for dinner. Surprisingly, these folks were vegetarians. They didn't eat meat or anything other than vegetable soup. Most of their vegetables were grown in harsh climate conditions, which might have been why they were usually so hard on Northern's stomach to digest. He opened his door and entered, then raised an eyebrow. Act surprised. You'll need to do better than that to surprise me. Of course, he had sensed her presence the moment he touched the doorknob. She had just stepped into his room at that time. What's the occasion? Raven tilted her head with a curious expression. We made a plan earlier today. Isn't it right to come back and report what we've discovered? Oh, that, yeah. She narrowed her eyes at Northern with the intensity of a viper. That? Did you forget? Of course not. Why would I forget? Northern casually pulled off his blue cloak and threw it on the bed. Then he turned to Raven. Actually, I think I found something quite interesting. Me too, Raven said. Northern looked at her for a moment and then gestured with his hand. Do you want to go first? No, you go first, she replied. He nodded. Okay, then. He sat on the bed and began. He told Raven about his idea to teach the boy king the human language, which made her mouth open slightly. He explained their exercises and how the boy had interchanged the words ruler and subject. While he didn't want to overthink it, his theory was that the boy was trying to convey something important with those words. In fact, Northern had deliberately chosen those words and that specific exercise to see if the boy would react. He had devised several exercises like that, meant to serve as questions of sorts. Instead of asking them directly, he posed them through the exercises, hoping the boy king would be clever enough to recognize them as questions. Even if he wasn't, Northern was sure that if something was truly wrong, one of these questions disguised as exercises would strike a chord with the boy and cause him to act strangely. Fortunately, it had happened on the first try. Raven unfolded her arms and leaned away from the wall. Still, what if he just misunderstood? Northern lowered his head, frowning slightly. That's possible. But what are the chances he got it wrong? Ulzard is smart. I'll give him that. So, do you want to bet that something is wrong? That the ruler is the subject and the subjects are the rulers? Northern looked at her. Given how strange their culture has been so far, it wouldn't be too far-fetched, would it? Raven nodded. You're right. It's a gamble. But I don't think we have a better choice. Yeah. Northern murmured. They both fell silent for a while. Then Northern spoke again. Your turn. What did you find? Chapter 292. The Kidnapping, Part 1. Raven took a little time to breathe in and out before she started her part of the report. Her voice was calm, serene, and soothing to the night as she said, all day, I checked around the city, from block to block, house to house, and I found absolutely nothing. Northern raised a brow. I'm pretty disappointed. He got interrupted before he could finish. Raven continued. Then I waited till night and decided to check around some more. It was then I ended up finding myself around the palace. She paused, looking out the window and gazing at the trailing colors in the sky. I decided to check the most unsuspicious place, and then I found something weird happen. Her words piqued Northern's interest. One could see his eyes focus on her with keen attention. And that is, his voice dripped with anticipation. It was hot. A small frown creased Northern's brows first. Then as the seconds flew by and Raven's words settled in, the frown deepened on his face. Hot? That's strange. I know, right? I thought the same thing. The mountain situated at the back of the palace is supposed to be the coldest place in this region due to the amalgamation of ice and snow there. But it's hot. Which is very weird. It is. Northern squinted his eyes, staring down for a little bit. Then he shot up to his feet. I think that is our clue to whatever is going on in this place. Raven nodded. Me too. Our attention should be on that place. Raven smiled. I left my bird there. Your bird? Northern cocked his head a little bit as he inquired. Then he remembered before Raven got the chance to respond. Oh, that. He muttered. Yes, that. A slight cocky smirk ghosted Raven's lips. Couple of seconds passed. Then she just had to comment. Don't worry. No one can find out about the bird. Even you didn't. Northern frowned at her. But her voice trailed before he could shoot his words. It's not your fault though, she said. The technique itself is created to mask itself using the atmospheric essence. As long as there is essence in the air or even in the soul, no one can ever sense it. If it is used against me too, I probably wouldn't know. Yeah. Good, so what's the plan moving forward? We are going to maintain low-key surveillance over the place? While you try to find out more about this subject-ruler situation from your student. Northern narrowed his eyes at her. For a couple of seconds, silence drenched the air in the room. Then he whispered mockingly. I sense contempt in your voice. It's dripping with contempt. Raven in response stared down at him with indifference. However, this time, her indifference seemed a little forced. She scoffed and looked away from him. Then walked towards the window and said over her shoulder. I guess your fun time is about to come to an end? Teacher Northern. Northern retracted his head with a grin. It was fun while it lasted. I never really adored it to begin with though. Then his eyes became somewhat distant. But Ulzard, he's a special kid. A really good kid. Raven looked at him for a few beats and turned her head away, wearing her usual indifference on her face like a cloak. Then she flew out the window, fluttering away into the air. Northern gazed towards the window for a long time before he heaved a sigh and retreated to his bed. Tomorrow would be another long day. Northern lay on the bed for a couple of seconds, finding it hard for his mind to find rest. Then he decided to dive into the limitless void. He manifested himself upon the throne and sank into the large seat languidly, observing the endless amount of pillars that sprawled forth. Been a while since I saw Night Terror. Northern immediately summoned the profile of his favorite void summon. Name Night Terror. True name. Singularity. Danger level. Devil. Void rank. Echo. Void ability. Void flames. Soul fragments. 566/1000. Northern's mouth dropped. 566 soul fragments? Has this guy been going around killing? Oh, crap. Northern was a bit fearful. Although it didn't really matter much to him, to maintain a semblance of humanity, he really hoped Night Terror didn't go around killing humans. He could trust that the stalwart summon of his wouldn't kill Ellis, but he couldn't say the same for other humans that pestered or got in his way. Northern heaved a tough sigh and summoned his own profile. Name, Northern Longguard. True name, Nameless, Superscript 1. Attributes, Formless, Spawn of Void, Limitless Void, Vestige of Chaos and Void, All Eyes, Chaos Thread, Flames of Chaos. Soul rank, Drifter. Void summons, 6/100. Talent fragments, 948/2000. Copied talents, 1/2. Own talents, 1. Attribute abilities, active/passive. September 10th. Owned items, Mortal Blade, Eternal Twilight, Silver Sword, Death Glare, and 5 others. I have 948. I did kill a lot of Lumidrakes and armored serpents. He smiled, satisfied with his speed. Close to 1000 is good. I should become a nomad by the time I leave this rift. Northern paused. His eyes glowed with an intense and dangerous blue flame. He felt a strange urge to dream higher, farther. He was aware that dreaming too far could leave him shattered and disappointed with his growth in cases where he should be grateful. Which was why he had been careful so far. So if one was to put it in a way, he was trying to cut his clothes according to his size. But legends were not carved by people who were careful. The thought of shooting that far caused him to be nervous. But that was exactly how Northern knew he was doing the right thing. That nervousness, that fear had to be it. His brows furrowed and the fire in his eyes ignited brighter, stronger, more intimidating and fearsome. I will become a master before I get out of this gate, he murmured to himself. This was just more than mere talking. He was going to do everything to bring it into fruition. Northern thought to himself. However, his thoughts were interrupted by something. A deep frown fell upon Northern's face. He could clearly know what was going on in the other plane of reality even though he was here. He wasn't sure what to do, whether to stay in the void a little more or wake up. Because right now, his body was being hauled away from his room. Am I being kidnapped? Chapter 293. The Kidnapping Part 2. Northern sat cross-legged on the enormous throne. There was no vivid way to tell what exactly was going on. Being in the limitless void worked like he was pretending to be asleep. He could feel and tell what was going on around his body, but not vividly. I wish I could see what's going on with some kind of outside body oversight. That would have made his predicament a much more solvable one. But Northern couldn't, so all he could do right now was just sit around and wait. He sat there, arms folded and eyes closed, waiting for the moment the motion would stop at the very least. Suddenly, a sharp sensation jolted him from his reverie. Northern's eyes flew open. Not in the limitless void, but in the tangible world. As a dark silhouette burst through the window, spinning with deadly grace and scattering the white walkers like leaves in a storm. In an instant, Northern sprang to his feet, but the heavy chains binding his wrists and ankles pulled him back. He struggled against the restraints, the cold bite of the metal a stark reminder of his captivity. Raven stood before him, her sword held forward with a dark, determined expression. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that Northern had rarely seen. "Crap! What is going on all of a sudden? Woman, stay out of this." One of the White Walkers, who had recovered quickly, snarled at Raven, his voice dripping with authority. But Raven merely cocked her head, a cold smile playing at her lips, and in a blur of motion, she vanished. She reappeared behind the White Walker, her blade slicing through his neck with effortless precision. His head tumbled into the air, and she swung her sword sideways, the blade clean and gleaming once more as she wiped it of gore with ease. The remaining White Walkers hesitated, their eyes flicking nervously between Raven and Northern. She glared at them, her stance shifting as she prepared to launch herself forward again. The ensuing massacre was swift and brutal. Raven moved like a dark ghost. Each swing of her sword was calculated, each strike lethal. She flowed through the White Walkers with a deadly grace, her movements too fast to follow. Within moments, she stood before Northern with a rusted key in hand, freeing him from his shackles. Northern frowned as he stood, rubbing his wrists. "I wonder if I have an unknown fetish for shackles or something," he muttered, casting a wary glance at the lifeless bodies strewn across the room. He looked at Raven. "What's going on?" "I was attacked," she said curtly, her eyes still scanning the hall. "I think we've been discovered." "Discovered how?" "My bird has been destroyed," she replied, her voice tinged with a cold fury. The loss of her familiar seemed to cut deeper than any wound, and Northern could feel the simmering anger beneath her calm facade. Northern thought for a while, then exhaled. "Will you be fine if I ask you to head to the back of the palace on your own?" Raven looked at him. "What will you be doing?" "I need to find Ulzard. You said Terrence asked us to run away with him, right?" "Yes. But if we are running, why am I going to where the source of trouble is?" Raven asked with a slightly confused expression. Northern allowed a pale smile and said, "That's because we won't be running." Raven frowned deeply, but Northern continued, his voice calm and resolute. "You are angry, are you not? I don't know what the bird means to you, but right now you are trying so much to contain yourself. It's permissible. But you see, Raven, I was just thinking a couple of minutes back that I want to become a master before I leave this gate." Raven's frown eased slightly as they heard the distant approach of multiple footsteps. "I can't become a master by running away," Northern continued. "Helena was right in a way, and my problem was that I was trying to play safe, while still saying I didn't want to be complacent. I didn't want to be reckless, I didn't want to be radical. But it doesn't matter right now because right now, I feel so pressured by the things I know." He shook his head slightly, a determined glint in his eyes. "I can feel it. A storm is coming for me, and I don't know anything at all. Which is why I want to start fighting from henceforth." He materialized the Soul Taker in one hand, the blade humming with a soft, resonant power as he allowed the feeling from earlier to sink into his soul again. The White Walkers were already at both ends of the hall, their weapons drawn and eyes glowing with a fierce, icy light. Northern turned to face one end while Raven faced the other, their backs almost touching. Then he muttered to her, "You too. You don't need to hold back anymore." The words were barely out of his mouth when they both surged forward, their movements a blur of coordinated destruction. Northern's blade sang through the air, meeting the first White Walker with a swift, upward slash that cleaved through flesh and bone. The creature crumpled to the ground, its icy blood spreading in a violet pool. "Congratulations. You have slain a disastrous hellion. You have gained 4 talent fragments." Northern's body again moved instinctively, and Soul Taker took another turn, swinging in a perfect arc and slicing through the icy air. The blade met resistance for only a split second before cutting through the other White Walker's body, leaving a trail of shimmering, ghostly light in its wake. The creature fell, its severed parts hitting the ground with a dull thud. "Congratulations. You have slain a disastrous hellion. You have gained 4 talent fragments." Raven was like a force, her swordsmanship, which was usually a blend of grace and skill, transitioning into a convolution of brutality. She moved with the fluidity of a shadow, her blade slicing through the enemies around and leaving them with crude and unsightly gashes. Her strikes were swift and sure, each one finding its mark, and at times she lunged multiple attacks at the same point, dealing the creatures with a whirlwind of furious strikes. A White Walker lunged at her, but she sidestepped effortlessly, driving her sword through his heart before spinning to decapitate another attacker. Chapter 294, Raise the Bars. Northern, of course, with chaos eyes and a dawning understanding of swordsmanship itself, could execute a sharper and swifter attack. He parried a spear thrust, the weapon clanging against his blade, and countered with a quick, downward slash that severed his opponent's arm. The White Walker screamed, a chilling sound that echoed through the hall, and Northern finished him with a swift strike to the neck. "Congratulations, you have." Northern's eyes parted into two on each part and were lighted with a predatory glow as he moved through the darkness in the hall. Each flicker of movement, every nuance in the White Walker's stances, was laid bare before his eyes even when he seemed not to be watching. He was taking his time to experiment with the lessons he had learned from the voice with the keywords. Hold your sword like a bird, firm enough that it won't escape but gentle enough not to crush it. Let it be an extension of your hand, not just an object that you wield. While the first sentence was practical, the other statement was something he was still trying to figure out. He hoped for every strike, every swing of his sword to guide him towards a better understanding of the statement. But each felled his opponent, and his understanding of the practicality that those words meant didn't sink in. While it is something that one could understand easily, it was a different feel from realizing it with actions. Just like he could for the first statement. Holding his sword like a bird, firm enough that it won't escape but gentle enough not to crush it, was with a sense of realization. The sword felt alive in his hands and sometimes, in conjunction with the vision scope of his chaos eyes, it was as if the sword itself was guiding him through the best route of attack. Northern loved it. He didn't even know when his eyes were filled with gore while spilling the blood of these monsters. He very much resembled the monster this time around. Northern relaxed his composure as he felled another one and looked at the last White Walker with a predatory menace. The White Walker grimaced and launched at him with a spear, the weapon slicing through the air with a fierce whistle. Northern sidestepped, his body fluid and reactive, and parried the spear. In the same motion, he brought his sword down in a swift, ruthless arc, severing the creature's arm. The White Walker howled, the sound a bone-chilling wail that echoed through the cavernous hall. Northern slowly walked towards the monster while it crawled away quickly. He stabbed his sword into its leg before it could crawl any further, pinning it to the ground. Then bent down and glared into the White Walker's eyes, his wafting with horror mixed with menace, alighting his eyes with an ethereal blue glow. Just at the time Raven also reached in front of him. She looked at him and said, "I think you should focus on securing Ulzard. I'll take it from here." Northern raised his eyes at her. He could understand what she meant. He plunged out his sword, causing the White Walker to cry out once more. Then he disappeared into the darkness of the hall. Seconds later, the hall was filled with the gruesome cries of the White Walker. Northern blizzarded through the channels of halls and finally got to a large double door. But in front of that door was a familiar enemy. Krulgath, who was standing at the door alone with his eyes closed, opened his eyes and looked up at Northern. Northern's hasty stop came to a slow fade, and he cautiously moved towards the Commander-General of the White Walkers. Northern finally arrived barely 5 meters away from him and came to a halt. The two stood face to face for a couple of pressuring seconds. Then Northern made an absurd statement. "Will you be willing to let me kidnap Ulzard without a fight?" he said. Immediately, a deep fiery frown fell on the creature's face. He threw his hand down and grabbed his bone axe quickly, shooting towards Northern with mad speed. He brought the sword heavily upon Northern. In that split second that Krulgath lunged, Northern's pulse quickened, the air vibrating with the very force of the White Walker's mad charge. The bone axe sang a deathly soft song as it descended in a brutal arc. But Northern's instincts kicked in. His chaos eyes dilated, perceiving each minute detail in perfect and slowed clarity. He slid to the side, narrowly evading the axe's deadly edge. The impact of Krolgath's swing reverberated through the ground as it smashed into the stone floor, sending shards of rock flying. Northern didn't waste a moment. Using the momentum of his sidestep, he brought his sword up in a fluid motion, aiming for Krolgath's exposed side. But of course, the commander was quicker than he seemed. Krolgath's free hand shot out, deflecting Northern's blade. A portion of his fist hardened with ice. The clash, although like the sound of metal on metal, rang out like a death knell. Northern's sword vibrated in his grip, but he tightened his hold, the grip like a bird, firm but not crushing. Krolgath growled, a sound that was more beast than man, reminding Northern in that blinking moment that in the end, these lots were monsters. And that reminder flickered in Northern's eyes as they became dead cold as Krolgath swung his axe in a backhanded sweep. Northern ducked, feeling the rush of air as the axe narrowly missed his head. He rolled forward, springing to his feet behind Krolgath and delivered a quick, precise slash across the creature's back. A line of darkish violet blood welled up from the cut, but Krolgath hardly seemed to notice. He spun around, his axe a blur of motion, and Northern had to leap backward to avoid being cleaved in two. The force of Krolgath's swing was immense. Even as Northern dodged, he could feel the pressure wave from the axe's swing. Northern circled his opponent, his eyes flickering, taking in every detail. Krolgath was a formidable opponent. He had seen that much from the commander's fight with Raven. His movements were powerful and controlled, his strikes deadly and deliberate. If Northern would win this fight, he needed to find a weakness, and he paused right there. While that seemed like a smart thing, Northern felt wrong somewhat. I have been in a much worse rift and survived. I am powerful, I should be able to do this by sheer overwhelming strength and not exploiting his weakness. For some reason, right now, Northern was grinning with so much excitement. Chapter 295, The Taste of Freedom is the Liberation of Fears. Northern's grin widened as he faced Krolgath, the icy air between them charged with the tension of what was to come. It was like the monster could tell that things were about to take an intense and different turn. The chaos eyes burned with an unworldly light, the glow mirrored in the predatory glint of Northern's gaze. Northern right now was savoring the thought of how interesting this experience was going to be, and that alone was leaving a distorted grin on his face. One that seemed to increasingly piss off the commander. Krolgath tightened his grip on his bone axe. The White Walker's eyes narrowed, calculating and wary. He took a cautious step forward, the heavy bone axe held aloft, poised for another devastating strike. But suddenly Northern was gone. He surged forward in a zigzag trail, leaving confusing patterns of movement, yet fluid and swift with it. His eyes parted into 4 different eyeballs while in motion, before Krolgath could even tell what was going on. His hand holding the axe flew into the air, rolling and then landing afar. The commander stared at him, dazed and dumbfounded. He still had not recovered from his confusion just now from Northern's bizarre movement. That was the source of everything. That sudden movement of his along with his blinding speed had so disoriented the commander that he didn't know where to attack. He didn't know what was the best course of defense either. And that momentary disorientation was all Northern needed to deal a devastating strike, thus leaving the commander of the White Walker Guards with only one arm. For a couple of seconds, Krolgath's face was etched with fear, his eyes quivering at the might of the humans standing before him. However, the White Walker suddenly seemed to calm the next minute, and breathed. Then he looked at his amputated hand. Ice began to grow from it and grew so long, coalescing into a sharp tip. Then it hardened, exuding specks of ice like tiny shards of glass. I'm glad you still have those tricks up your sleeve. Else my little experiment would have come to an end so quickly. Krolgath's eyes hardened, the icy glint returning as he adjusted to his new weapon. A crystalline spear formed from his own essence. He shifted his stance, lowering his body slightly, the ice weapon gleaming in the dim light of the hall. Northern's grin grew wider, the chaos eyes flaring with anticipation. "Shall we, brethren?" Without warning, Krulgath lunged forward, his newly formed ice spear thrusting towards Northern's chest. But Northern was ready, every detail, every twitch of muscle effortlessly played out before his eyes. It was almost like Krulgath's body movement was begging to be seen. Northern easily sidestepped, the spear slicing through the air inches from his body. In a fluid motion, Northern countered, his sword arcing downwards in a lethal strike aimed at Krulgath's remaining arm. But the White Walker was quicker this time. He twisted his body, the ice spear parrying Northern's blade with a resonant clash. However, distracted by that clash, he didn't see that Northern was already hauling in a black stiletto from beneath. Belatedly realizing, the White Walker furrowed his brow and immediately Northern's stilettos bounced off. Following the bounce back, Northern also gave space and landed a couple of meters away from the commander. He was glaring at him with an intense fury. But Northern was not intimidated, not even in the slightest. If anything, he was enjoying this. What he aimed to do was quite simple. He wanted to make use of his two things, chaos and formless. Formless had been somewhat useless since he didn't know his way around it. But the first time he used the heritage ability of chaos, he felt like the reason it felt so natural to him was partly because of formless. The faceless voice had also complemented his ability to easily get the demonstration of the sword. If there was anything Northern knew about himself, it was the fact that wielding the sword had never been so easy for him. Shin would always go, "This should be easy, you should be able to do this, do that." But he just simply had no talent for it. While that made him sad, he was also well aware that the sword was not the only path to strength. Plus he didn't give up. It was hard for him to pick up basic skills compared to other people, but he still kept at it. Shin would give him basic drills, and they would spar, although sometimes it was lame enough to be called a joke. However, those moments all put together have built a little bit of skill in him that he was able to at the very least hold a sword and swing it. However, being able to copy Night Terror? Nah, that had to come from formless. Northern had totally missed that idea, and it was only clicking when he used the chaos step, much after the voice complimented him. So this exercise, battle right now, Northern had thought of it as a good opportunity to see for himself what he could do by really pushing himself. By leaving his comfort zone. And it was beginning to get exciting. Really exciting. Hell, he could even die anytime. Krulgath could get the better of him and everything he had worked for could vanish in that slight moment of mistake. But right now, that fear didn't matter. Northern was just brimming with so much excitement. He smiled again as he straightened his back before the commander and muttered, "I just might get used to this." Again their clash resumed. Krulgath shot forward like a frenzied arrow, came to an abrupt stop before Northern, in the means expressing an insane level of speed control. He spun around, bringing the spear around in a wide sweep aimed at Northern's legs. Northern leaped back, the spear just missing his knees, and landed lightly, already moving to close the distance again. Northern exhibited a quick and chaotic movement, not zigzag this time around, but the movement was sharp, abrupt, and disjointed. Inasmuch as Krulgath had poised himself not to be thrown off by Northern's, now weird attacks, he still couldn't help how defenseless he felt. He staggered back in a hurry and attempted to jump away, but before he could, Northern was upon him. Chapter 296. The Thief of Names. Northern's eyes glowed menacingly as he unleashed an upward slash in that tight space. Krulgath was able to react quickly, parrying the attack even though he lost his balance. However, that was a big mistake. It would have probably worked with any other opponent. It was a last-moment call that proved his reflex. But this Northern right now was a monster that had thirsted for the freedom from fear. Just as the commander lost his balance, an onyx blade viciously streaked towards him from below like a black mamba. It was too late to react. Even if he had the time, he couldn't have been reflexive enough to counter it when it was so low. However, he could harden his body just like he had done before. And so as the sword found its mark, it bounced off again. But a wild glee could be seen on Northern's face, which made the commander very confused. Why the happiness? "You didn't win, you bastard," was probably how he had thought at that moment. Northern's hand, the soul taker, streaked towards it in that selfsame moment. Everything seemed to play out in slow motion. That movement was utterly impossible. The recoil from that parry, to ignore it and just throw his hands forward right after he had thrown one, was an insane amount of task for the body. It should be impossible, and even if it is achieved, it should leave the individual with a twisted, or at least wholly deformed, joint. The White Walker watched Northern's sword bite deep into his chest as his ass kissed the ground. His face was a mixture of pain, confusion, and awe. Human. Strong. Very strong. Northern returned the black mortal blade and scoffed. Then he uttered, "That's not even the highlight of it." Northern moved closer to the White Walker. He swung his spear hand, but Northern paid no attention to it and just deflected with negligent ease. He stabbed the soul taker into the monster's chest yet again, causing it to squeeze out a deafening cry. Northern stepped on its groin and grabbed both its horns and began to pull them apart. The commander cried viciously, filling the dark hall with horrific screams. Finally, Northern broke its horns and threw them away. He placed his palm on the creature's head and closed his eyes. Immediately, a tab appeared before him. Then he opened his eyes with a little smile. It worked. In the tab he saw, "Conditions have been met. You can use the ability of your name. Nameless. You have no essence, you have no identity. You are a storm that seeks to swallow and steal the identity and essence of everything around you. Nameless. This is the beginning of your path to ruin. Do you want to absorb target true name? Krulgath." Note: there are two paths to absorbing names. Path 1. They can be stored and bestowed to a designated target. For now, this feature only works with void and soul summons. Path 2. They can be destroyed and broken into name shards. Name shards can be used to create a new name or reinforce attributes ability. Currently, you have one absorbed name, Daughter of the Lost Skies. Hence, choose your path wisely. Do you want to absorb true name? Krulgath. Overwhelmed by a lot of thoughts from the information he just saw, Northern spent a couple of seconds in silence, then finally muttered, "Yes." Immediately, a bone-wrenching sound could be heard from the White Walker's body. He began to convulse. It was like his bones were being broken and remade. Then after a few seconds, the process stopped and left the commander lying on the ground, heavily panting. Something about him had changed. Northern took his eyes down. "You have absorbed name Krulgath. As you have absorbed the true name, you have absorbed the attributes and abilities that are attached to it. Due to the nature of your name, you can temporarily bestow upon yourself a name, activating the attributes and abilities." Northern stared in amazement. So many things he wanted to process, but what first caught his attention was the pitiful state of the White Walker. Monster profile. Name: White Walker. True name: Nil. Rank: Hellion. Danger level: Disaster. Attributes: Nil. Abilities: Nil. Having his name taken has caused the commander to fall from grace. His physical form was much smaller and less pronounced than a couple of minutes ago. He was just like the others. While before, he boasted of large, tight muscles that seemed to ripple with every slight movement. He had lost everything.
I'm a Pold.
Northern had gained everything the monster had. He had stolen everything from it. His name, his power, everything was gone. And not just that, he could temporarily use the name he absorbs and use their power. Northern began to chuckle like a deranged person. How interesting can this get? At this rate, he'd become the world's strongest just because he tried a little bit harder. That was on a lighter mood. He wasn't as stupid as to let these achievements get over his head. If anything, he was now being more careful. He had more than one use for a monster, which makes thoughtlessly killing them for talent fragments intolerable. On one hand, growing just became a little more complicated, but on a grander scale of things, it will all come back to add up in the end. What he just needed was time and the mastery of efficiency. Northern folded his arms and bore down at the now skinny commander. He slowly rose up, hands and legs trembling. "I will kill you. Even his voice was trembling, not finding a stable tone. Northern watched with a wicked glint in his eyes, thinking for a while. Then he parted his lips and spoke. I think I should kill you, but I won't gain much from killing you. Losing his true name had caused the commander to drop in danger level, hence, tremendously diminishing in strength. If Northern was to kill him now, he'd only gain 4 talent fragments, akin to having killed him while he was a catastrophe. That was quite small. But there was a better way to make this fun. Northern grinned as the idea fully formed in his head. So, here's what is going to happen. I will spare you, and wait for you to come back to have your vengeance. What I'm saying is, use this drive of defeat to get stronger, gain another name, become stronger, and make sure you defeat me. If you entertain me, I'll give you an honorable death. However, if you disappoint me, I'll just take everything from you and have you start from the beginning again. After Northern made himself clear, he dropped a last glance at the commander and walked away, heading into Ulzard's room. Chapter 297. The Traverser, Part 1. Northern came to an abrupt pause when he entered the room. He looked around, but the boy king was nowhere to be found. The large bed in the center of the nearly ornamental room was empty, with rumpled sheets. There were signs of a struggle. A broken ice plant vase, an overturned table, and an open window. Northern's eyes slowly drifted towards the open window. They narrowed to a slit. Immediately, Northern flashed through the room and flew out the window, his chaos eyes dilating. As he flew outside, the night terror armor wove around his body, trailing black sparks. Then Northern landed on the ground with a powerful thud, accompanied by a massive snow shockwave. He didn't stop. Instead, he dashed forward, running towards a specific location. A few minutes after he began to run, Northern noticed white walkers popping up behind him in desperate pursuit. At first, he ignored them and kept speeding forward, focused on his own target. He weaved between the corners of houses and even plunged into a garden, destroying delicate plants with his heavy boots. Then he arrived at an open snowy space that led uphill towards the left of the main gate. Northern glared up and looked down. The white walkers were getting closer, their faces contorted with anger and madness. For some reason tonight, the settlement seemed eerily quiet. Although it was nighttime and everyone should be sleeping, Northern found it strange that not a single white walker had come out. After all, the ones he and Raven had been dealing with were the guards. He turned his head back to the front, then lowered his feet, focusing his strength on them. He pushed one foot slightly forward. Chaos is a footwork technique aimed at maximum efficiency with convenient output. So, it should be possible for me to reach my best speed without exhausting myself too early. A slight frown creased his brows as he channeled more power into his legs. The lustrous armor covering his calves seemed to pulsate like liquid as he lowered his legs and then, in a frightening instant, he released all the momentum. In that instant, Northern turned into a straight line of bluish-black light that streaked across the snow beneath the blue-purple velvety sky, leaving a trail of raging snow that obscured the path of his pursuers, and at the same time catching up to his target in the blink of an eye. Northern collided with the figure, causing them both to tumble into the snow and scatter apart. Quickly, Northern stood up and looked at Ulzard's kidnapper as he slowly stood, holding his head. When he stood up completely, what Northern saw made his eyes widen first. Then his face contorted into a deep frown. What is going on here? How come this guy looks so human in every way? The person standing before him was tall, lean, and muscular. He had no shirt on, and his skin was like a canvas of resilience, marked with countless slashes, the jagged lines crossing his torso like a warrior's map of honor. Ah! This is infuriating. The person mumbled in a monstrous tongue, running his hand through his hair, which was a tousled mop of silvery strands that framed a rugged and sharp face, betraying a wild, untamed life. Eyes of molten gold burned with an intensity that could pierce through the soul, their gaze unwavering and fierce. He wore baggy, deep ebony pants, loose and flowing, billowing slightly with his every movement. A green sash cinched his waist, and slung casually across his back was a sword that Northern had been observing for several seconds. Growing more certain about, "That's definitely a katana. There's no way I'm mistaking it," he thought. Its ornate hilt, peeking over the person's shoulders, was intricately wrapped in dark silk, ending in a brass pommel that bore ancient symbols, like a silent sentinel ready to leap into action. Northern found this presence very strange. He seemed human in every way, and even his monstrous tongue was more refined and smoother than others. With a slight frown, Northern peered into the information of the person standing before him. Profile: Name: Khalidhel Tauron. True name: Legs of Wind. Attributes: Way of the Wind. Soul rank: Sage. Soul core saturation: Middle. Talent: Wind stride. Talent class: A. Talent ability: Velocity dash, Shuanpa, Time warp, Sonic surge, Breeze. Immediately, Northern's mouth fell open. However, at the same time, target profile has been blocked. You cannot see the target profile anymore. Wait, he's a sage? Why was I able to see that? There was no explanation Northern could give presently, but the only thing he could think about was what had changed with his eyes. The see ability undoubtedly must have been affected. You've been silent this whole time, so you've been sneaking your eyes into my soul. Even the texture of the person's voice was mashed with elegance. His aura was almost divine and intimidating, despite his rugged appearance. And most of all, he was shirtless in this freezing region. That alone left Northern on edge. He thought for a fleeting second about what had just happened. Never before had he been blocked out while observing someone's profile. This calls for an upgrade, Northern thought, but there was so much to do that he didn't want to focus on upgrades for now. Becoming a master was his first goal. Does he not understand me? The person wondered aloud as Northern had not spoken a word till now. I do understand you. I am just rather curious. Who are you? You are different from these other creatures. Northern glanced back at the white walkers that were slowly reaching them. The guy sighed and mumbled, "Aren't you a traverser?" "I am a traverser like you." Northern raised an eyebrow. "Sorry, what now? A traverser? What is that?" "The rift. I entered it first. I've been here for 172 nights, preparing to defeat this realm. However, you and your lady suddenly stormed in and ruined things for me. Now, the whole process is speeding up because of it." Northern found it hard to keep up, given that there were things the guy was saying that needed much more clarity before he could move forward. His mind kept dwelling on them. "I'm sorry, are you from the Dark Continent too?" Northern inquired. But the person looked confused and shook his head. "I have no idea what that is." A strange question then tingled at Northern's throat. He felt asking it might reveal a reality he never knew existed. He hesitated for a while but eventually asked, "Where are you from? Who are you?" Chapter 298. The Traverser Part 2. Huh? Where am I from? The man paused for a moment, scratching his head. Then he said, "Where do I start? Do you know Strenot?" Northern cocked his head. Strenot. He racked his brain, certain there was no such place in the Central Plains or Stelia. The man sighed, adding in a dejected tone, "I don't expect you to know. You're an insider." He was using terms that only confused Northern further. His voice trailed off again. "But are you sure you want to be having this conversation right now? You're trying to take the boy to Sura, aren't you?" Northern frowned. This was information they had only because of their oracle friend. This guy knew about Sura. He did mention he's been here for 172 nights, so he must have been doing his research. Many questions popped into Northern's mind, but he knew their current situation didn't allow for that. He glanced back at the White Walkers, who were cautiously approaching them. Looking at the stranger, Northern split himself in two. The second one, however, instead of appearing beside him, materialized where the young king lay. It immediately grabbed him and leapt back before the stranger could react. In that same instant, a gleaming black-skinned monster, the Corpse Eater, appeared between the stranger and the clone. The stranger turned to Northern, who wore a small smirk. He shrugged slightly, raising his hands. And here I was thinking we were on the same side. Northern's lip twitched upward as he observed the White Walkers, who were also wary of the tense atmosphere, then fixed his azure eyes on the stranger. You see, I have a little issue with trust. He paused, looking down briefly. Okay, little might be an understatement, but the point is, I'm not foolish enough to trust someone I just met. If you want to be on the same side, the boy stays with me. How distasteful. He glanced between the second Northern, the corpse eater, and Northern before continuing. Fine. But look, I've been here much longer than you have. I know where things are, and unless you know how to get to Sura, I think you need my help. Oh well, I guess I don't need your help then. As soon as Northern said this, a frown creased his brow. What did you say? Northern shrugged. I have no plans to go to Sura, at least not now. I have a lot to deal with, you see. He turned to the White Walkers as he finished, two swords materializing in his hands. Wait, are you insane? You're going to fight them? This is a community of monsters, with a vicious commander. Northern looked away for a second with a smug grin and mumbled. Vicious commander, my foot. The stranger tilted his head back slightly, confusion etched on his face. What do you mean? Northern shrugged again and turned away. Do whatever you want. I don't even know you to begin with. Just don't get in my way. He assumed a fighting stance, readying his swords to launch himself forward. Meanwhile, the stranger remained confused. He observed Northern's clone and the corpse eater before returning his gaze to Northern. He knew he had to make a decision, preferably not an unreasonable one like fighting an entire community of monsters, and not just any monsters. These possessed a concerning level of intelligence, which would undoubtedly prove to be a difficult battle. And yet, does he not know the dangers? Is he just being a reckless brat? The stranger clicked his tongue. I hate reckless brats. But that clone of his. Moreover, this monster. It gives off the vibe of an incredibly strong foe. Then there's him too. This is an utterly reckless battle. I might be better off moving with him on my own terms. His recklessness will kill him either way. I can just take the boy and escape in that time. Although it's a plan I'd still have to refine considerably. He sighed and looked at Northern, who by now was already plunging his sword into one monster's throat with ease, withdrawing it and separating its head with a spinning strike. Without pause, he launched a kick at the next one. He wasn't even looking, so his movements were impressive. He swung his hand to the left, harvesting gore from the White Walker that ran towards him. This was followed by another sword swing that sent its hand rolling through the air like a ragdoll. Then Northern displayed extra aesthetically pleasing skill, twisting himself and delivering a final blow to the neck, leaving a crude X marring the monster completely. In that meantime, the stranger, having made his decision, streaked towards Northern in a blur and delivered a bone-crunching punch to the White Walker Northern had kicked away, now upon Northern. You can save the thank you for later. Northern stared at the man and gave a displeased frown, muttering as he turned his head away. I already had it under control anyway. I've decided to aid you in your recklessness. I shall be a formidable ally to you, undoubtedly. Northern scowled. What the hell is he feeling like? Of course, Northern was well aware that the stranger wasn't wrong in any way. He was a sage. One with a speed-based ability. In fact, Northern needed him to stick around. How else would he copy that speed talent? The nonchalant attitude was all a front he had put on since he now had ulcered. The fact that he came all this way to kidnap the Boy King was proof that whatever was going on in this rift, ulcered was a core part of it. Which was why Northern secured the Boy King immediately. Now, the strange stranger had no choice but to move with him. And Northern, all he needed was for that speed ability to be used. Chapter 299 He's strong. Northern and the stranger were a combo to boot. As Northern displaced the monsters with his sword, he watched with one eye compartment to see if the stranger wasn't trying to do anything funny like attack him from behind. Or perhaps, get smart with his clone and monster. But the guy just continually fought the White Walkers. His movements were swift and fluid, very swift and way better than any Northern had come across. Raven, of course, would always be in a lane of her own. But this guy was a befitting comparison to her, though her speed didn't even come close. In less than 5 minutes, they were done. Of course, the stranger was done first, but not less than 30 seconds later had Northern cut down the last of his foes. He turned to the stranger, who immediately asked him, "So what next?" "We regroup with my partner. Mind you, I'm not letting you take possession of the boy, and if you think the easier way to get rid of my clone and summon is to just kill me, then you'd be making a big mistake. Because first things first, I'm unkillable." The stranger smirked and shrugged. "We'll see about that, won't we? I'm rather elated to meet this partner of yours. Where is she?" Northern turned his head to the cliff that served as the backdrop for the entire settlement. His eyes were telling the answer obviously, and the moment the stranger realized that, his expression became pale. Hey, come on now. Don't do that to yourself." Northern frowned slightly and looked deep into his eyes. "Don't do what? Why would you or anyone go there? Your priority right now should be finding Sura. Which we will after we find out what the hell is going on in this place." The stranger face-palmed himself, raising his head a little bit in the process and dropping it dejectedly. I can't believe I have decided to follow lunatics who would walk into their own grave." Northern watched for a couple of seconds, wondering why he was acting like that. He knew it was dangerous. That place was very shady. They had even killed Raven's familiar in less than an hour, something that no one should have been able to find out. So no doubt it was a lair where danger lurked, but it was totally okay. Because he had made a rule to himself not to back down this time around. He just really hoped the stranger too doesn't back down. He really hoped. "Are you moving or not?" he asked, almost in a nonchalant tone. The guy looked at him for a couple of seconds, thinking deeply before his golden eyes moved to Northern. "Do you even have any idea what you are doing?" Northern pretended to think for a while and responded blankly. "Yes, going to meet my partner." "Okay then, if you insist on me walking you to your death, it most definitely will be my honor." Northern turned and walked away. Naturally, his clone and the corpse eater followed him. After a couple of minutes, they were already at the base of the mountain, heading back to the settlement. However, as they approached it, Northern suddenly stopped. Also wary, the stranger asked, "What do you sense?" "What do I sense?" "He's quite observant." Northern smiled and lingered before telling him. Khalidhel. You can just call me Cal, for short." "Okay, Cal, there are a lot of monsters coming for us. At first, I thought it was weird that none of them came out of their houses while I was running through. Perhaps they didn't come out because they were not there initially." With a slight frown, Cal asked, "And now, where are they?" Northern tapped his foot on the ground. Slowly, Cal's golden eyes drifted down. He squinted his eyes and used his leg to softly press the snow. Even with that, he couldn't feel anything. Noting the confused look on his face, Northern immediately added, "Not here, towards the city." Cal's eyes followed through immediately. He still couldn't see anything that Northern was saying, but at the very least, he didn't look like he doubted him. "So what do we do?" Northern, with the Soul Taker in hand, moved to scratch his jaw. "What else? We fight. By the way, are you the voice?" Cal tilted his head. "What voice?" Never mind." Cal's voice was more harsh, whereas that one was froggy and kind of tender. They were two distinct voices. Moreover, the tone of their voices was very different. Northern didn't think it would be Cal too. He was just curious. However, he regretted it the moment he asked. "Let's just focus on vanquishing what's in front of us. I've gotten quite bored too. Surely I don't mind a stretch or two," he said, stretching his hands and legs, then smacking his fists together in readiness to plunge into battle. Confused, Northern asked him, "Won't you take out your sword?" Cal raised a brow and chuckled. "Take out my sword? No, these ones don't deserve that much privilege. Stainless is special. I don't just use her on anyone." "I see." Must be why you go around hanging her behind your back when you can just return. Wait, did I say her? He paused hurriedly, shocked at himself. Cal smiled in response and nodded, his grin growing wider. Yes, you did. And I appreciate it, but there's an order effect of hers that benefits me while she's like this. Northern nodded in understanding. I see. Then he looked away and placed both swords above his shoulders. Well then, I wish you good luck. He mumbled and then plunged into the settlement, leaving a blast of snow as he ran forward. Cal nodded his head slightly with downturned lips, but a little hint of impression reflected in his eyes. He turned his eyes to the clone. Immediately, the corpse eater opened its mouth and screeched at him, causing the guy to tremble a little bit. He could feel the fear run through his blood. Hell, I have no doubt about it, it's an abysmal rank. How does he have an abysmal rank for a summon? What is that guy really? Thwum! The entire place resounded with a trembling sound as snows exploded upwards, and from within it, jumped out White Walkers. Male and female, all of them were armed with crude weapons and fierce gazes, glaring towards the enemy they now surrounded. Northern. Watching from afar, Cal curved up a corner of his lips in a little smile. Let's see how he handles this. He was very curious about Northern's strength. Before his very eyes, 2 more clones appeared beside Northern, each of them wielding a dagger each. All 3 Northerns backed to each other. In a frightening flash, they each plunged in different directions. The first White Walker swung a bone axe at Northern's head. He ducked, feeling the icy wind of its passage ruffle his hair, and countered with a swift upward slash that severed the creature's arm at the elbow. Violet, freezing blood sprayed across the snow, and Northern followed through with a downward strike that cleaved through the walker's skull, splitting it like a melon. His clone to the right was engaged in a fierce duel with a pair of White Walkers. They attacked in tandem, their crude stilettos flashing in the darkness. The clone parried a sword thrust with one dagger and dove in to block a hammer strike with the other. The former spun on his heel, the dagger dancing in his hands, and opened up the throat of one attacker with a swift, precise cut. The walker gurgled, clutching at its neck as it fell. The other clone used the time and moment to leap forward, burying his dagger into the chest of the second walker. The creature spasmed, then went limp as the clone withdrew his blade and turned to face the next threat. He shot towards his left, quickly becoming a whirlwind of death, his dagger flashing like silver lightning. He dodged a spear thrust, the weapon plunging into the snow where he had stood, and retaliated with a flurry of slashes that left his attacker in tatters. Another walker charged at him, swinging a massive club. The clone rolled under the blow, came up behind the creature, and drove his dagger into the base of its skull with a sickening crunch. The walker dropped like a stone, and the clone was already moving on to the next foe. Congratulations, you have slain a... You have gained. Congratulations, you have slain a... You have gained. Congratulations, you have slain a... You have gained. There was nothing that sweetened Northern more than these messages that came his way. He was harvesting so many fragments with ease. He was killing monsters. 2 of his clones were also on a continuous killing spree. The system didn't even stop and continually popped with these messages. And Northern himself didn't even mind. He just sliced off heads like tofu with a crazy grin of enjoyment plastered to his face. Cal stood, letting out a pale smile with a tense expression on his face. He could tell from Northern's movement, he just could tell. He's strong. Chapter 300. New talent copied. Cal stood in awe for a couple more seconds, staring at Northern as he shot between the White Walkers, swinging his sword with swiftness and precision. His focus was so acute and deep that Cal's eyes sparkled, and he couldn't help but wonder how it would feel fighting such a person. He smirked. I literally forgot myself. He scratched his hair for a bit and smiled with his eyes. Then he clenched his fist and began to casually walk forward, clenching even harder, so hard that his veins were almost popping out. A leisurely White Walker lunged towards him but was met by a bone-breaking backhanded punch, one that sent him rolling in the air and crunching into the ground. Without even looking to confirm the death of his foe, Cal continued forward. Another one got in front of him, but before that one could land a blow with his whitish sword, Cal was already behind the White Walker. A fraction of a second later, the neck of the creature let out a crunching sound and bent sideways, with Cal's hand oozing smoke. More White Walkers came towards him, but he got into stance and lazily hung one hand low between his legs, the other one holding his hip. It was quite the odd stance for a speedster. The next instant, however, he disappeared. Cal's disappearance was almost imperceptible, like a flicker in the air. One moment he was standing, his hands in that lazy, almost disdainful stance, and the next he was gone. The White Walkers, initially confused, looked around wildly, their primitive minds struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Northern, in the midst of his own deadly fray, caught glimpses of Cal's movements from a compartment of his eyes. It was a blur of motion, almost too fast to track, but he could see the devastation Cal left in his wake. It was like watching a shadow move through the snow, leaving a trail of destruction. A White Walker lunged at Northern with a spear, and he sidestepped, parrying the thrust with one sword while slashing across the creature's chest with the other. The Walker staggered back, blood pouring from the deep gash, and Northern pressed his advantage, driving his blade through its heart. As the Walker fell, Northern took a moment to glance in Cal's direction, and then he looked down, a grin slowly coming to his face. "Do you want a copy talent? Windstride, A-class? For 900 talent fragments." Northern raised a brow. 900 talent fragments. Shin's talent was A-class and it was priced 300. What is this? Note: talents are worth per ranks. When a talent of the master rank is copied, all the talent abilities are copied with it. When the talent of a sage is copied, all the talent abilities are copied with it. In these two situations, one is stronger than the other, and it does not matter to your soul since you don't have a soul core. You can properly utilize the talent abilities despite not being a sage. Plus you have a head start that they don't. By the time you become a sage, you'd have more talent abilities than any sage should have. Hence the cost for copying talents is always doubled. That is, Master, A-class, 300 talent fragments. Savant, A-class, 600 talent fragments. Sage, A-class, 900 fragments. And this is applicable to every talent regardless of their classes. Northern nodded in understanding. This was the first time the system had explained something in such detail, and he was so glad about it. Before, he had thought his companion wasn't much of a talker until when necessary. But what made him happiest were the prospects that copying this talent would bring and the discovery he had just made. To essentially put it, he was better off copying talents of higher ranks than himself than looking forward to someone that is on his level. Because he'd be copying and starting with their own achievements. Northern didn't know if he would be able to grow the talents like they could, because when a drifter advances in rank, he unlocks a talent ability. Now, Northern wasn't sure if he could. It didn't happen for advanced cloning. But he had a proposition which he couldn't be too sure about. If it turned out that what he could unlock as talent abilities, as he advances, is own talents and not copied talents, then his proposition would be on point, and that would mean he is definitely bound to be the strongest in the world. All he had to do was seek after stronger people. Whether it was to be their ally or their foe. It didn't matter as long as he was able to copy their talents. Northern chuckled eerily. Things are just about to get better. He finally muttered his response to the system. Yes. Congratulations. You have copied talent. Windstride, A-class. Talent ability. Velocity dash has been added. Talent ability. Shuanpa has been added. Talent ability. Time warp has been added. Talent ability. Sonic surge has been added. Talent ability. Breeze has been added. Northern felt the settling feel. It was slight, but there was a subtle change that reflected in his muscles. It was tough to put into words and was not vivid enough to be able to call it real. So Northern just thought of it as a reflection of the changes that ability brought to his soul. After all, it was the talent of a sage. He had gained the talent of a sage. Practically speaking, by talent and power alone, he was a sage, but his mindset and experience were still far from where they should be. And perhaps he was truly beginning to see that, and maybe perhaps not. Northern stood aloof for a second, then stretched his legs sideways, bent down and stretched them very well. He did the same for his second leg and finally stood up. Now then, shall we start properly, friends and foes? If you want access to fast updates or the full novel in high-quality audio, contact me now and buy. I offer over 300 complete audiobooks from Pocket FM, Webnovel, Audible, and more. No locked episodes, no subscriptions, just one-time payment via PayPal or Ko-fi. Message me directly on Telegram or WhatsApp, or check out the full list of available novels on Discord. Start listening to your next favorite audiobook today.